So this is a subsection of a chapter that's titled, "If You're Not for War, You're for Tyrants, Slavery, and Nazism." The United States was born out of a war against the figure of King George, whose crimes are listed in the Declaration of Independence. George Washington was correspondingly glorified. King George of England and his government were guilty of the crimes alleged, but other colonies gained their rights and independence without a war. As with all wars, no matter how old and glorious, the American Revolution was driven by lies. The story of the Boston Massacre, for example, was distorted beyond recognition, including in an engraving by Paul Revere that depicted the British as butchers. Benjamin Franklin produced a fake issue of the Boston Independent in which the British boasted of scalp hunting. Thomas Paine and other pamphleteers sold the colonists on war, but not without misdirection and false promises. Howard Zinn describes what happened. Quote, "Around 1776, certain important people in the English colonies made a discovery that would prove enormously useful for the next 200 years. They found that by creating a nation, a symbol, a legal unity called the United States, they could take over land, profits, and political power from favorites of the British Empire. In the process, they could hold back a number of potential rebellions and create a consensus of popular support for the rule of a new privileged leadership." End quote. As Zinn notes, prior to the Revolution, there had been 18 uprisings against colonial governments, 6 black rebellions, and 40 riots, and the political elites saw a possibility of redirecting anger toward England. Still, the poor, who would not profit from the war or reap its political rewards, had to be compelled by force to fight in it. Many, including slaves promised greater liberty by the British, deserted or switched sides. Punishment for infractions in the Continental Army was 100 lashes. When George Washington, the richest man in America, was unable to convince Congress to raise the legal limit to 500 lashes, he considered using hard labor as a punishment instead, but dropped that idea because the hard labor would have been indistinguishable from regular service in the Continental Army. Soldiers also deserted because they needed food, clothing, shelter, medicine, and money. They signed up for pay, were not paid, and endangered their families' well-beings by remaining in the Army unpaid. About 2/3 of them were ambivalent to or against the cause for which they were fighting and suffering. Popular rebellions like Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts would follow the Revolutionary victory. The American revolutionaries were also able to open up the West to expansion and wars against the Native Americans, something the British had been forbidding. The American Revolution, the very act of birth and liberation for the United States, was also a war of expansion and conquest. King George, according to the Declaration of Independence, had endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages. Of course, those were people fighting in defense of their lands and lives. Victory at Yorktown was bad news for their future, as England signed their lands over to the new nation. Another sacred war in U.S. history, the Civil War, was fought, so many believe, in order to put an end to the evil of slavery. In reality, that goal was a belated excuse for a war already well underway, much like spreading democracy to Iraq became a belated justification for a war begun in 2003, overwhelmingly in the name of eliminating fictional weaponry. In fact, the mission of ending slavery was required to justify a war that had become too horrifying to be justified solely by the empty political goal of union. Patriotism had not yet been puffed up into quite the enormity it is today. Casualties were mounting sharply, 25,000 at Shiloh, 20,000 at Bull Run, 24,000 in a day at Antietam. A week after Antietam, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed the slaves only where Lincoln could not free the slaves, except by winning the war. His orders freed slaves only in southern states that had seceded, not in border states that remained in the Union. Yale historian Harry Stout explains why Lincoln took this step. Quote, "By Lincoln's calculation, the killing must continue on ever grander scales, but for that to succeed, the people must be persuaded to shed blood without reservation. This in turn required a moral certitude that the killing was just. Only emancipation, Lincoln's last card, would provide such certitude." The proclamation also worked against Britons entering the war on the side of the South. We can't know for certain what would have happened to the colonies without the Revolution, or to slavery without the Civil War. But we know that much of the rest of the hemisphere ended colonial rule and slavery without wars. Had Congress found the decency to end slavery through legislation, perhaps the nation would have ended it without division. Had the American South been permitted to secede in peace and the fugitive slave law been easily repealed by the North, it seems unlikely slavery would have lasted much longer. The Mexican-American War, which was fought in part in order to expand slavery, an expansion that may have helped lead to the Civil War, is less talked about. When the United States, in the course of that war, forced Mexico to give up its northern territories, American diplomat Nicholas Trist negotiated most firmly on one point. He wrote to the U.S. Secretary of State, quote, "I assured the Mexicans that if it were in their power to offer me the whole territory described in our project, increased tenfold in value, and in addition to that covered a foot thick all over with pure gold, upon the single condition that slavery should be excluded therefrom, I could not entertain the offer for a moment." End quote. Was that war fought against evil too? The most sacred and unquestionable war in U.S. history, however, is World War II. I'll save a full discussion of this war for Chapter 4, but note here only that in the minds of many Americans today, World War II was justified because of the degree of evilness of Adolf Hitler, and that evilness is to be found above all in the Holocaust. But you won't find any recruitment posters of Uncle Sam saying, "I want you to save the Jews." When a resolution was introduced in the U.S. Senate in 1934 expressing surprise and pain at Germany's actions and asking that Germany restore rights to Jews, the State Department caused it to be buried in committee. By 1937, Poland had developed a plan to send Jews to Madagascar, and the Dominican Republic had a plan to accept them as well. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain of Great Britain came up with a plan to send Germany's Jews to Tanganyika in East Africa. Representatives of the United States, Britain, and South American nations met at Lake Geneva in July of '38, and all agreed that none of them would accept the Jews. On November 15, 1938, reporters asked President Franklin Roosevelt what could be done. He replied that he would refuse to consider allowing more immigrants than the standard quota system allowed. Bills were introduced in Congress to allow 20,000 Jews under the age of 14 to enter the United States. Senator Robert Wagner, Democrat, New York, said, "Thousands of American families have already expressed their willingness to take refugee children into their homes." End quote. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt set aside her anti-Semitism to support the legislation, but her husband successfully blocked it for years. In July 1940, Adolf Eichmann, architect of the Holocaust, intended to send all Jews to Madagascar, which now belonged to Germany, France having been occupied. The ships would need to wait only until the British, which now meant Winston Churchill, ended their blockade. That day never came. On November 25, 1940, the French ambassador asked the U.S. Secretary of State to consider accepting German Jewish refugees then in France. On December 21st, the Secretary of State declined. By July 1941, the Nazis had determined that a final solution for the Jews would consist of genocide rather than expulsion. In 1942, with the assistance of the Census Bureau, the United States locked up 110,000 Japanese Americans and Japanese in various internment camps, primarily on the West Coast, where they were identified by numbers rather than names. This action taken by President Roosevelt was supported 2 years later by the U.S. Supreme Court. In 1943, off-duty white U.S. troops attacked Latinos and African Americans in Los Angeles' Zoot Suit riots, stripping and beating them in the streets in a manner that would have made Hitler proud. The Los Angeles City Council, in a remarkable effort to blame the victims, responded by banning the style of clothing worn by the Mexican immigrants, called the Zoot Suit. When U.S. troops were crammed onto the Queen Mary in 1945, headed for the European War, blacks were kept apart from whites and stowed in the depths of the ship near the engine room, as far as possible from fresh air, in the same location in which blacks had been brought to America from Africa centuries before. African American soldiers who survived World War II could not legally return home to many parts of the United States if they had married white women overseas. White soldiers who had married Asians were up against the same anti-miscegenation laws in 15 states. It is simply preposterous to suggest that the United States fought World War II against racial injustice or to save the Jews. What we are told wars are for is extremely different from what they are really for. And that goes on and on. I want to take questions, but I'll say a couple words about things that I'm working on, things that you can do to make things better, other than getting a million of these and taking them to counter recruitment tables.